In the darkness of a pitch-black Siberian night, a large airliner is plummeting toward the ground. The only person in control of the aircraft, sitting in the captain's seat, is a terrified 15-year-old boy. Despite desperate efforts to take over, the first officer is seated too far back and can't properly reach the controls. With every minute, the aircraft loses several thousand feet, getting closer and closer to the mountainous terrain underneath. Was it a hijacking gone wrong or a reckless act of showboating? How did an airliner on a routine international flight end up in a vertical dive with a child at the controls, and who can stop the disaster before it's too late? This is the story of Aeroflot Flight 593. On March 22, 1994, at around 4 p.m. local time, an Aeroflot Airbus A310 was preparing for a long eastbound journey from Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport in Russia to Hong Kong. At only 2.5 years since the date of manufacture, this A310 had accumulated over 5,300 hours of flight time, quite typical for a long-range airliner of its type. Officially owned by a French bank, the aircraft was leased to Aeroflot, bearing its colors and a French registration. The aircraft was to be operated as Aeroflot Flight 593 on a direct route from Moscow to Hong Kong, with a total of 63 passengers, including 25 foreigners. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the aircraft was pushed back from the gate, started its engines, and began taxiing for departure. The flight to Hong Kong would take approximately 10 hours, traveling over western and central Russia before crossing into Mongolia and, a few hours later, central China, arriving at the destination just before noon, local time. Sitting in the left seat was a 40-year-old Captain Andrei Danilov, with a total flight time of over 9,600 hours, including 950 hours on the A310. Prior to his transition to the A310, he had accumulated 4,700 hours as a captain on the Tu-134, a Soviet short to mid-range jet airliner. Accompanying Captain Danilov in the right seat was a 33-year-old First Officer Igor Piskarev with a total flight time of over 5,800 hours. He had over 3,100 hours of flight time as a captain, also on the Tu-134. There was a third crew member on this flight, Captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky. As the relief pilot on Flight 593, his role was to replace each of the other two pilots during the cruise portion of the flight so that they could take turns and have rest before landing in Hong Kong. At 39 years of age, Kudrinsky had over 8,900 hours of flight time, with 900 hours as a captain on the A310. Prior to starting his training on the Airbus, he had flown multiple Soviet aircraft, including IL-76, a large transport category airliner.
Before we continue, I want to thank the paid partner of today's video, BetterHelp. Sometimes life just gets heavy. You keep going, trying to stay strong, but inside you're exhausted. It's like you're carrying too much and no one really notices. I remember feeling that way, completely drained, like I was out of strength. But somewhere deep down, I still believed things could get better, even if I didn't know how yet. What turned things around wasn't some big breakthrough. It was finally slowing down, talking about what was really going on, and realizing I didn't have to do it all alone. That's what BetterHelp is for. It's the biggest online therapy platform in the world, with thousands of credentialed therapists who actually get what you're going through. And you don't have to sit in a waiting room or drive across town. You can talk to a therapist on video, on the phone, or even just by chat, whatever feels easiest. And if the first one doesn't feel like the right match, you can switch until you find someone who clicks. With a 4.3-star Trustpilot rating and millions of people already using it, BetterHelp has helped a lot of people take that first step. If you want to give it a try, head to betterhelp.com/aircrashinvestigation or pick Air Crash Investigation at sign up for 10% off your first month. Because honestly, starting is the hardest part, and BetterHelp makes that easier. Now let's get back to the video.
Because the aircraft type was new to the company, all three pilots had only been flying the A310 for under 2 years. The flight crew and the entire airline were relatively new to this aircraft, as well as a Western-built aircraft in general, especially the new state-of-the-art avionics suite. After a short taxi with 3 pilots at the front and 9 flight attendants taking care of the passengers in the cabin, carrying a total of 75 people, the Aeroflot Airbus A310 lined up on the runway, ready for takeoff. The flight crew applied full power, and a few moments later, the airliner was airborne and in a turn toward the east. With a payload equivalent to only a quarter of its maximum capacity, the Airbus soared into the sky, reaching its initial cruise altitude in 12 minutes. Within 30 minutes from departure, Flight 593 had leveled off at 33,100 feet, or 10,100 meters, fully settled on its eastbound route. As the flight attendants finished serving dinner to everyone on board, the night fell, and with 9 more hours to go, most passengers relaxed in their seats for the long overnight journey. The weather forecast had predicted a smooth and quiet ride all the way to Hong Kong, and there was no reason for concern. 4 hours into the flight, as Flight 593 was nearing the border with Mongolia, things were still quiet and routine inside the Airbus A310. Captain Danilov had left the flight deck to take his scheduled rest, while his first officer remained monitoring the flight with Captain Kudrinsky, the designated relief pilot. At this time, however, the 2 pilots were not alone in the flight deck. They were joined by another pilot from Aeroflot, who was flying as a passenger, as well as 2 teenagers. A proud dad, Captain Kudrinsky had taken his son and daughter, Eldar and Yana, along for the ride to Hong Kong and invited them to the flight deck for a visit. It was a violation to allow strangers inside the flight deck in and of itself. The cockpit, designed for only a handful of crew, was now crowded with 5 people, including 2 children. But what happened next took the situation to a whole new level. A few minutes later, the captain stood up, inviting his daughter Yana to take his place in the left seat. Wanting to make it feel like she was flying the plane, the captain made changes to the control modes of the autopilot and then told Yana to hold the yoke. The captain switched from navigation mode, which kept the plane locked onto its planned route, to heading mode. By doing this, he was able to direct the autopilot to gently bank the aircraft to the left, creating the feeling that Yana's hands on the yoke were guiding the turn. For a moment, she believed she was flying the plane herself, though in reality, the autopilot was still in full control. With Yana still holding on, Kudrinsky then commanded a turn back to the right. Once the aircraft intercepted its programmed route, he re-engaged navigation mode, and Flight 593 settled back on course as if nothing had happened. Soon after, the children switched, and the captain's son Eldar sat down in the left seat. His father repeated the same maneuver, commanding the autopilot to make a turn to approximately 15 degrees to the left before turning back to the right. This time, however, things did not go as smoothly.
Can I turn the yoke myself?
Yeah, just watch where you're going. We're turning to the left, so turn the yoke to the left.
Curious about what it would feel like to fly the airplane, Eldar asked his dad if he could move the yoke. Knowing that the autopilot was still engaged and not getting concerned about it, Kudrinsky did not object. As he reset the heading to an intercept course and re-engaged the navigation mode, the captain turned around to talk to his daughter, shifting his focus from monitoring the flight instruments. Meanwhile, the airplane flew through the flight plan route and continued the turn to the right. But something was not right, and nobody caught it yet. While clueless Eldar continued to push the control column to the right, this resistance to the autopilot caused the aircraft's automation to engage the override function. Designed to prioritize pilot input in case of an emergency, the function disconnected the autopilot from the ailerons without fully disengaging it. This feature was intended to provide the pilots with an opportunity to quickly take over if needed. Because the rest of the autopilot functions, such as altitude control, were still active, there was no visual or oral alerts informing the crew of the override condition. Distracted by their visitors, the pilots did not immediately notice anything unusual, instead focusing on other tasks not related to flying, such as filming the children with a tape recorder. Meanwhile, Eldar turned the yoke even further to the right, slowly but continuously increasing the aircraft's bank past the 20-degree mark. Although everything seemed normal at the time, a silent battle between the human and the machine was well underway.
Why is it turning?
Is it turning on its own?
Yeah.
With neither pilot paying close attention to the aircraft's instruments, the captain's son was the first to figure out that something was wrong. He correctly realized that the aircraft kept turning, but did not know that he himself was the reason why. After a few seconds of internal discussions, one of the pilots suggested that the aircraft was entering a hold, and the other two agreed. A hold, representing a looped racetrack flight pattern, is a common procedure performed in instances when an aircraft is not able to fly further along the planned route and is instead required to stay within its current position. It involves flying over a predetermined location and is usually, but not always, requested by air traffic control. However, Flight 593 had not received any such instruction, and neither had the flight made changes to the aircraft's flight management system to command a hold procedure to all three pilots. Meanwhile, the right bank continued increasing. With it, the lift produced by the wings started to slowly decrease, and thus a higher angle of attack was needed to maintain the altitude. In response to the changing conditions, the autopilot raised the nose of the aircraft. While everyone inside the flight deck argued over why the airplane kept turning on its own, the bank angle exceeded the 45-degree mark, passing and greatly exceeding the recommended 30-degree limit. At the same time, the autopilot had reached its authorized range of flight control movement and could no longer maintain the pre-selected altitude. Unnoticed by anyone inside the flight deck, Flight 593 began descending toward the ground. A few seconds later, the airliner banked over 50 degrees to the right and, still nose up, approached its critical angle of attack. The angle between the wing and the oncoming airflow at which the lift is no longer sufficient to keep the aircraft in level flight. Suddenly, violent shakes rattled the entire cabin. Known as buffeting, this was a sign that the airflow over the wings was severely disrupted and an aerodynamic stall was imminent. It was also a clear sign to the crew that things were not just abnormal, but they were much worse than expected. And yet, the pilots did not have an opportunity to realize what was wrong. Shaking out of control, the A310 suddenly pitched up even higher, reached its critical angle of attack, and stalled. No longer producing adequate lift of the wings, the airliner dropped the nose and sped up toward the ground. Realizing that the plane was still in a hard bank, which by then had reached the 60-degree mark, First Officer Piskarev turned his yoke all the way to the left to level the wings, but his action was hindered by yet another safety design feature. Normally, the flight controls in the Airbus A310 are interconnected. Moving one yoke moves the other, and both manipulate the ailerons together. However, the system includes mechanical decouplers that allow one yoke to temporarily disconnect from the other if opposing forces are applied. In the case of Flight 593, Eldar, still in the captain's seat and being told by his dad to hold the yoke, kept in a near-neutral position while Piskarev turned his yoke to the leftmost position. This caused the control columns to declutch, with yoke controlling its respective side. Thus, the first officer's yoke only moved the ailerons on the right side, while the left ailerons remained neutral. As a result, the aircraft's response to the inputs was milder than desired and insufficient for the situation. Noticing very little response to his inputs, the first officer turned the yoke to the right, then back to the left. Much like everyone else on board, having no outside references due to flying in the dark, he became spatially disoriented, not fully understanding what the aircraft was doing and questioning his own actions. With the aircraft hurtling toward the ground, the first officer became everyone's biggest hope. But controlling the plane proved a struggle for him. Earlier in the flight, he had moved his seat all the way back for comfort, making him barely able to reach his flight controls. Although he managed to pull the yoke back, which disengaged the autopilot, making precise inputs was extremely difficult. The situation inside the flight deck had turned into true chaos, and the captain desperately needed to get back in his seat. However, that turned out to be more challenging than expected. Although the aircraft was no longer in a spiral dive, the uncontrolled tumbling through the air created intense G-forces that pinned the teenage boy to the captain's seat. He simply could not lift himself up. Watching the airspeed rapidly rise and concerned about exceeding the aircraft's limits, the first officer instructed the other two pilots to reduce the thrust levers to idle power. At the same time, he pulled the yoke back as far as he could in an effort to stop the dive and level off the aircraft. The airliner listened to his commands, raising its nose, and the airspeed began to decrease. After a few seconds of sheer panic, Flight 593 was gaining altitude. Still worried about excessive airspeed, Piskarev continued pulling the yoke as far back as he could, raising the nose of the airplane and aiming it at the star-filled sky. As the load forces on the aircraft weakened, the captain was finally able to switch with his son, instantly hopping back into his seat. It seemed that the worst of the night was behind them, and they were close to a full and safe recovery. And yet, a crucial mistake was made. As Captain Kudrinsky was getting into his seat and adjusting his position, he inadvertently pushed the left rudder pedal with his feet. With the aircraft in a high angle of attack, crawling at a dangerously low airspeed, the single rudder deflection became the final and gruesome ingredient that triggered a spin. A dangerous maneuver that sometimes can become uncontrollable with no chance of recovery. Flipping fully upside down, the airliner once again dropped its nose and plummeted toward the ground, violently swirling through the air. The pilots pulled back on the yoke with full force in the hopes of slowing the aircraft down and recovering from the dive. The altimeter needles spun unforgivingly, showing a rapid loss of altitude as the pilots pushed the rudder pedals in both directions, doing what they could to break the spin. At last, the rotation stopped. The airspeed began to increase again. Degree by degree, the nose of the aircraft started to rise toward the horizon. Recovery was not just possible, it was within reach, but only if there had been enough altitude. Just before midnight local time on March 22, 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 slammed into the frozen hills of South Siberia, less than 200 miles from the city of Novosibirsk. All 75 people on board perished on impact. The story of Flight 593 is a chilling reminder that every rule in aviation has been paid for in blood. What was meant to be a proud milestone in Captain Kudrinsky's career and a special moment for his family turned into a losing battle for survival. While the captain's choice was found to be the root cause of the accident, the investigation board also highlighted flaws in the design of Airbus aircraft automation that did not inform the pilots of the changes in autopilot mode, as well as critical gaps in crew training. This kept the pilots from noticing the disaster unfolding in its early stages when easy recovery was still likely. Through a thorough analysis, the investigators concluded that the bank could be stopped in 6 seconds only if it had been detected before it reached 40 degrees. Lastly, had the yoke been brought back to the neutral position instead of fully aft during the final seconds of the flight, the aircraft would have most likely recovered from the dive on its own. In the months that followed the crash, grief quickly turned into outrage. Families of the victims, including several from Hong Kong, filed lawsuits against Aeroflot, accusing the airline of negligence and concealment. Aeroflot's insurers offered compensation of around $130,000 per family, but many relatives called it insulting. Others joined international legal actions. Grace Lamb, a widow from New York, sued the airline under the Warsaw Convention, while law firms in France pursued settlements on behalf of families against both Aeroflot and Airbus, reaching confidential agreements years later. Though no criminal trial ever convicted the crew or the airline, the litigation revealed a systemic lack of safety culture within Aeroflot and a dangerously casual approach to cockpit discipline. The tragedy also reshaped aviation policy worldwide. Airlines reinforced cockpit security rules, banning passengers, even off-duty pilots or family members, from entering the flight deck during flight. Airbus introduced clearer autopilot status alerts to prevent silent mode changes, and new training programs across Russia emphasized human factors and automation awareness. What had once been a father's innocent gesture of pride became a defining lesson written into global aviation textbooks. And yet, beneath all the technical reforms and legal filings, Flight 593 remains a haunting story of human fragility. How a few seconds of distraction can erase 75 lives. It reminds us that technology may guide the skies, but trust, discipline, and humility still keep us above the clouds.